What if I told you that the rising tension between Israel and Iran today, with drone strikes, nuclear warnings, and secret proxy wars, might not be just political? That for some, this conflict has roots far deeper, even mystical. That it might have been foretold in ancient texts, echoing through time from thousands of years ago. Crazy idea? Maybe. But it's exactly what we're going to explore. In this series, we're going to take a journey through history, religion, prophecy, and politics to ask a bold question. Is there really a prophecy about the Israel-Iran conflict from ancient times? And if there is, what does it say? But before we get to the so-called prophecies, we need to start with the foundation. Today, we begin with Part 1, the ancient seeds of a modern conflict. Before they became modern states locked in a geopolitical standoff, Israel and Iran were once the homes of two of the world's most ancient and influential civilizations. Their histories didn't begin with nuclear programs or peace treaties, but with kings, empires, temples, and scrolls. Let's start with Israel. The roots of Israel trace back to the ancient Israelites, a people whose story is recorded in the Hebrew Bible. According to tradition, their patriarch was Abraham, a man whose legacy is claimed not only by Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam. The Israelites went from nomadic tribes to an enslaved people in Egypt and eventually became a unified kingdom under King David and Solomon. But after centuries of turmoil, the kingdom split, was conquered, and the Jewish people were exiled. One of the most pivotal events in their early history was the Babylonian exile, where thousands of Jews were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon after the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BCE. And this is where ancient Persia enters the picture. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great, the ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, conquered Babylon. And rather than continuing the cycle of oppression, Cyrus issued an edict that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act earned him deep admiration from the Jewish people. In fact, the Hebrew Bible refers to Cyrus as the Lord's Anointed, a title rarely used for anyone outside Israel. He is remembered not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. So here's the twist. In the ancient world, the people of Israel and Persia, modern-day Iran, weren't enemies. They were allies. There's no ancient blood feud, no prophecy of destruction. If anything, there was mutual respect. So when did that relationship change? To understand that, we need to fast forward through centuries of shifting empires: Greece, Rome, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, and move into the religious and political changes that began shaping both nations as we know them today. On the Israel side, Judaism remained the core of national identity, even during long centuries of exile and diaspora. Meanwhile, in Persia, the ancient Zoroastrian religion was eventually replaced after the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE, when Islam spread across the region. Over time, Iran developed a strong religious identity centered around Shia Islam, which became its official state religion in the 16th century. This made Iran the spiritual and political heart of Shia Islam, in contrast to most other Muslim countries, which are Sunni majority.
This divide, Sunni versus Shia, is a major factor in modern Middle Eastern politics, and Iran's identity is deeply tied to its Shiite faith and heritage. But Israel? By the 20th century, most Jews lived in diaspora, scattered across the globe, including in Europe and the Middle East. Then came the defining moment, 1948. After World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, the modern state of Israel was founded in the historical land of the Jews. It was seen by Jews around the world as a miracle, but for the Arab and Muslim world, it was viewed as a colonial intrusion, a foreign presence in sacred territory. And yet, in a surprising twist, Iran, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had a friendly relationship with Israel. They had diplomatic ties, trade agreements, military cooperation. Israeli experts worked in Iran, and Iranian Jews were active in both countries. It was a niche relationship, yes, but a strong one. But then came 1979. The Islamic Revolution swept through Iran. The Shah was overthrown. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious leader, rose to power and declared Iran an Islamic republic based on strict Shia ideology. And with that, everything changed. Iran's stance toward Israel flipped overnight. The new regime called Israel the Little Satan and the United States the Great Satan. They viewed Israel not just as a political enemy, but as a religious and moral threat. In Khomeini's worldview, Israel was an illegitimate state, occupying Muslim land. Supporting Palestine became a sacred duty. From that moment, Israel and Iran became arch-enemies. There were no more embassies, no more cooperation, just distrust, propaganda, and behind-the-scenes confrontation. And this is when ancient texts start to reappear in the conversation, not in dusty libraries, but on TV and sermons on YouTube. Some evangelical Christian circles, especially in the West, began pointing to the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, chapters 38 and 39. It talks about a final battle in the latter days, when Israel will be attacked by a confederation of nations led by a mysterious figure named Gog of the land of Magog. This army will come from the far north, along with allies like Persia, Cush, and Put. According to the prophecy, God himself will intervene and destroy these enemies, showing his power to the world. Now here's the key part. Persia is literally named in this prophecy, and since Persia is modern-day Iran, many people have drawn a straight line from Ezekiel's vision to the Islamic Republic. Could it be? Is Iran playing the role of Magog in a real-life prophecy? Is this a script being followed unknowingly? Or are we just seeing patterns where there are none? The truth is, these prophecies are vague. They don't mention Iran or Israel as we understand them today, and like all ancient texts, they're open to interpretation. But when tensions rise, when missiles fly, people turn to old stories for meaning, and sometimes those stories become part of the conflict itself. In Part 2, we'll dive into the rise of the Islamic Republic, the development of Iran's nuclear ambitions, and how Israel's existential fears have transformed this conflict into what some now call a spiritual war. But for now, remember this: the seeds of today's clash were not planted in hate, but in history. And history, like prophecy, is never as simple as it first appears.
In the last part, we talked about how ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, was once a friend to the Jewish people. We saw how King Cyrus helped the Israelites return from exile, and how that ancient goodwill lasted through centuries, even into the early days of modern Israel. But everything changed in 1979. That year wasn't just a political turning point, it was a cultural earthquake. It shook Iran to its core and rippled through the entire Middle East. And the aftershocks are still being felt today. So let's rewind to Iran in the 1970s. Under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran was westernizing fast. Women were attending universities, alcohol flowed freely in Tehran's cafes, American music was everywhere, and the elite lived lavishly. The Shah had dreams of turning Iran into a global power, and Israel, it was one of his quiet partners. The two countries weren't just friendly, they had actual strategic cooperation. Israel sold weapons to Iran. Israeli experts helped build Iranian infrastructure. Even Mossad and Savak, the Iranian secret police, shared intelligence. This was a niche alliance, built not on shared religion, but shared enemies, mainly the Soviet Union and Arab nationalists. But under the surface, resentment was growing. For many ordinary Iranians, the Shah's regime felt oppressive, corrupt, and disconnected from their values. The lavish royal parties, the influence of Western companies, and the growing wealth gap all stirred anger. And that anger soon found a voice in a religious scholar living in exile, Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini wasn't just a cleric. He was a revolutionary with a vision of an Iran ruled by Islamic law, led by religious authorities instead of secular kings. His message spread like wildfire through cassette tapes, mosques, and underground gatherings. And by 1979, the revolution exploded. The Shah fled. Khomeini returned. And overnight, Iran transformed from a monarchy into an Islamic republic. But this new government didn't just change laws, it changed Iran's entire worldview. And that included how it saw Israel. To the new regime, Israel wasn't a country, it was a symbol of Western imperialism, of occupation, of injustice. Khomeini declared that Iran would be the defender of the oppressed, especially the Palestinians. The embassy of Israel in Tehran, it was handed over to the Palestinian Liberation Organization and became the Embassy of Palestine. The new Iran called Israel the Zionist regime and refused to recognize its existence. In sermons, speeches, and school books, Israel became the enemy, not just politically, but spiritually. This marked the beginning of a proxy war, one fought not on their own soil, but through allies, militias, and regional influence. Iran began funding groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, a Shiite militant group that would become one of Israel's fiercest enemies. They also supported Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. These groups launched attacks on Israel. Israel responded with military strikes. The cycle began. But behind all the rockets and rhetoric was something deeper: fear. Iran feared Western-backed regime change. Israel feared annihilation. And then came the nuclear question. In the early 2000s, it was revealed that Iran had been secretly enriching uranium, an essential step toward developing nuclear weapons. Iran claimed it was for peaceful energy purposes, but Israel and much of the world wasn't buying it.
For Israel, a nuclear Iran wasn't just a threat, it was an existential threat. Israeli officials began warning that they would never allow Iran to get the bomb. Some even hinted they would strike first to prevent it. This wasn't just diplomacy, this was survival. And here's where things take a mystical turn. As the nuclear tension escalated, people on both sides started invoking prophecies again. Remember Ezekiel 38 and 39? In evangelical circles, especially in the US, preachers began pointing to Iran's role in this so-called end times war. They said, look, Persia is mentioned. Israel is back in the land. The enemies are aligning. This is the setup. Some even claimed that the Islamic Republic of Iran was unknowingly fulfilling biblical prophecy, playing the role of Gog's allies in a final apocalyptic war. But not everyone agreed. Some Jewish scholars warned against reading ancient texts as political roadmaps. They said prophecy was meant to inspire moral reflection, not military action. Others pointed out that Ezekiel's vision wasn't literal. It was poetic, symbolic, a vision of justice, not destruction. Still, the narrative stuck. It made its way into politics, media, and even military speeches. And here's where the irony is. While evangelicals were framing Iran as a biblical villain, some in Iran were doing the exact same thing in reverse. Iranian leaders began invoking their own apocalyptic visions. In Shia Islam, there's a belief in the coming of the Mahdi, a messianic figure who will usher in an age of justice. Some hardline clerics spoke of preparing the world for his return, through resistance, through holy struggle, through confrontation with evil powers. And in that narrative, Israel was the evil power. So what we're seeing isn't just a political rivalry, it's a collision of narratives, of identities, of destinies. Both sides see themselves as righteous. Both feel threatened.
both turn to ancient texts to make sense of modern chaos. And that's what makes this conflict so dangerous. Because when people believe history is on their side, compromise feels like betrayal. The 2010s brought moments of hope and fear. The Iran nuclear deal of 2015 promised to freeze Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifted sanctions. Israel opposed it. The US under Obama supported it. Then Trump pulled out. Tensions soared again. And today, the standoff continues. Covert operations, cyber attacks, assassinations of nuclear scientists, drones in Syria, militias in Iraq. The conflict isn't a full-scale war, but it's not peace either. It's something in between. A shadow war. And while leaders posture and generals plan, millions of people, Iranians, Israelis, Palestinians, live under constant uncertainty, wondering where this path leads. In Part 3, we'll dive deeper into the prophetic interpretations that have shaped modern ideologies. We'll explore how Ezekiel, Daniel, and even Islamic Hadith are used to justify actions today. And we'll ask, are these texts really predicting the future, or are we using them to create the future we fear? The line between history and destiny is thin, and we are walking it every day.
We've talked about geopolitics, we've talked about revolutions, nuclear fears, proxy wars. But now, we go deeper. Because behind the headlines, the missiles and the fiery speeches, there's something more mysterious, something more powerful, driving the narrative for both Iran and Israel. Prophecy. Ancient prophecy, messianic visions, end times beliefs. It might sound dramatic, but for many, this isn't fiction. This is destiny. Let's start with the Hebrew Bible, specifically Ezekiel 38 and 39, the famous War of Gog and Magog. This passage describes a future invasion of Israel by a confederation of nations led by a mysterious figure named Gog from the land of Magog. Now, scholars have debated the identities of these nations for centuries, but many modern readers, especially evangelical Christians, believe that the Persia mentioned in the prophecy refers to modern-day Iran. Let's break that down. The passage says Gog will gather nations like Persia, Cush, and Put, and march against the unwalled villages of Israel. God intervenes, a massive earthquake strikes, chaos breaks out, and the invaders are destroyed. Then there's a time of great peace. To some, this sounds like a metaphor, but to others, it's a blueprint, a literal battle plan for the end of days. Here's where it gets interesting. In the United States, particularly among evangelical Christians, this idea has shaped foreign policy perspectives. Some believe Israel must be protected at all costs, not just for geopolitical reasons, but because they see it as fulfilling biblical prophecy. In this view, Iran is not just a country with a dangerous nuclear program. It's Persia rising again, a key player in a divine conflict. And the return of Jews to Israel? That's step one. The threat from the north? Step two. The clash between good and evil? That's what comes next. It's not just Christians thinking this way. In the Islamic Republic of Iran, prophecy plays an equally big role, but in a different language. In 12er Shia Islam, which is the dominant branch in Iran, there is a deep belief in the coming of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, a messianic figure who has been in occultation for centuries and one day will return to bring justice to the world. Some Iranian clerics believe the world must be prepared for his return. That includes standing against tyranny, fighting for oppressed peoples, especially Palestinians, and resisting powers viewed as unjust or corrupt, like Israel and the United States. And here's the eerie part. Both sides think they're the good guys in an apocalyptic showdown. Iran sees itself as a divine resistor. Israel sees itself as a divinely protected nation. And both point to ancient texts to validate their role. It's like they're both reading from the same script, just from opposite ends. Take the book of Daniel, another prophetic text. Some interpret it as a timeline for world empires, with Israel ultimately being redeemed. Others see it as laying out a sequence of kingdoms: Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, culminating in a final kingdom of God. Again, believers look at today's headlines and try to match the players to the prophecy.
In Iran, the idea of Armageddon also appears, though in Islamic terms. Some hardline figures have suggested that conflict, especially with Israel, is part of a holy path toward the Mahdi's appearance. Now, not every Iranian believes this. Not every Israeli believes in the Gog and Magog war, and not every Christian sees Iran as evil. But in the halls of power, these beliefs matter. They influence policies, they inspire speeches, they justify actions, and that's where things get dangerous. Because when leaders believe they're fulfilling destiny, not just defending borders, they become much harder to negotiate with. Think about it. If you believe your enemy isn't just wrong, but evil, then compromise looks like surrender. Diplomacy looks like delay. Peace looks like weakness. And every military strike becomes not just strategy, but salvation. It creates a kind of prophetic feedback loop. A politician says, "Look at the rising threat from Iran." A preacher responds, "It's just like Ezekiel said." The media amplifies it. People believe it. And suddenly, public opinion is no longer shaped by facts, but by fear. That fear, in turn, drives more aggression, which drives more belief, and the cycle continues. Now here's the big question. Are these prophecies really predicting the future? Or are we using them to create the future we expect? Because, let's be honest, many prophecies are vague. They use symbols, metaphors, dramatic imagery. They weren't written to be literal news reports. They were written to offer hope, warning, or meaning in times of crisis. But when you take a metaphor and treat it like a map, you might end up walking straight into the disaster you were trying to avoid. And maybe, just maybe, that's part of the tragedy here. What if these ancient texts weren't meant to push us toward war, but to warn us about its consequences? What if Gog and Magog isn't a forecast, but a mirror, reflecting what happens when nations let pride and fear rule them? What if the real battle isn't between Israel and Iran, but between hope and despair, wisdom and rage? That brings us to today. With every drone strike, with every speech calling for annihilation, with every nuclear threat, people on both sides dig deeper into their beliefs. They look for meaning. They ask, is this the moment? Is this the war we've been waiting for? Is the prophecy coming true? But the more we ask that, the more we risk turning it into a self-fulfilling prophecy. In Part 4, we'll explore that idea even further. We'll look at how modern leaders, media, and movements are shaping this narrative, and whether there's still a way out of the prophetic shadow. Because the future isn't written in stone, and maybe, just maybe, we still have a choice.
So far, we've seen how thousands of years of history, faith, and fear have brought Israel and Iran to the edge. From ancient texts to modern warfare, from prophetic visions to political speeches, this isn't just a conflict of nations, it's a collision of destinies. But here's the truth, we're still here. Despite the missiles, the threats, and the rising tension, we haven't crossed the line yet. Not completely, not irreversibly. So now comes the big question. Can we step back from the edge? Can Israel and Iran, two nations shaped by memory and myth, find a path that doesn't end in destruction? Let's be honest, it won't be easy. When you're told your enemy is ancient evil or divinely condemned. It's nearly impossible to see them as human. Dialogue turns to shouting. Strategy turns to survival, and every concession feels like betrayal. That's the trap of prophecy. Once you believe a war is meant to happen, then peace becomes the enemy. But maybe it's time we look at those prophecies differently. Let's go back to Ezekiel's vision of God in Magog. Some scholars have argued that it's not a prediction at all. It's a parable, a warning about pride, aggression, and what happens when nations ignore justice. In this reading, Israel isn't told to go looking for war. It's told to trust that if it stays righteous, even when surrounded, it will survive. It's not a call to arms. It's a call to faith. Likewise, in Islam, especially Shia Islam, the Mahdi doesn't return because people start wars. He returns because the world has descended into injustice, and his role is to restore balance. That's a huge difference. It means you don't bring the Mahdi by launching missiles. You prepare for him by building justice, not chaos. What's amazing is that when you dig into the deepest parts of both Jewish and Islamic traditions, you don't just find apocalyptic fire, you find messages of mercy. In Judaism, the concept of tikkun olam means repairing the world. In Islam, rahmah means divine mercy, and it's one of the most repeated qualities of God in the Quran. So why don't we hear more about that? Why are the microphones always pointed at the voices calling for war and not the ones calling for peace? Maybe it's because war makes headlines, peace doesn't. A drone strike is easier to explain than centuries of theology, and fear spreads faster than understanding. But here's something to remember. Just because propaganda is loud doesn't mean it's true. Just because some leaders claim to speak for God doesn't mean God is calling for war. And just because a prophecy has been interpreted one way for decades doesn't mean it can't be re-examined.
Think about it. Prophecy is never neutral. It always reflects the values of the interpreter. So if you believe the world is doomed, you'll see every enemy as proof. But if you believe the world can still be healed, you'll see every enemy as a challenge to overcome, not destroy. Even now, there are people in Israel and Iran, scholars, artists, dissidents, everyday citizens who refuse to be enemies. They challenge the dominant narrative. They ask harder questions. They reach across digital borders to speak with each other, to understand each other. They're rare, but they exist, and they matter. Because if prophecy is a mirror of our fears, then maybe dialogue is the doorway to something better. Look, this video isn't pretending to have all the answers. We're not claiming to decode the Bible or the Quran or predict the future, but we are asking this. What if the war between Israel and Iran doesn't have to end in fire? What if the ancient texts we keep reading as blueprints for apocalypse are actually warnings we're supposed to learn from? What if we stopped trying to fulfill prophecy and started trying to prevent it? That's the power of storytelling. That's the power of belief. It can either bind us to a path of destruction, or it can open up a future we haven't imagined yet. So here's how we'll close. Whether you believe in prophecy or not, whether you support one side or neither, one thing is clear. The future isn't written in stone. It's written by us, by the choices we make, by the voices we amplify, by the stories we tell. If we keep telling the story of inevitable war, we'll get war. But if we start telling the story of possible peace, even if it's hard, even if it's unpopular, then maybe, just maybe, we'll get something better. Maybe we are the generation that breaks the cycle. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive. If this video challenged you, inspired you, or made you think differently, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And drop your thoughts in the comments. because conversation is how change begins. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and stay hopeful.